Good evening, everybody. The Peninsula Foundation welcomes you all to today's expert lecture on the topic The Geopolitics of the Western Pacific. Our guest speaker for today is Dr. Vijay Sakuja, Vice President, Geopolitics and Transformational Paradigms at the Peninsula Foundation. Now I'll hand it over to the Air Marshal M. Matheswaran, founder and chairman of the Peninsula Foundation, to introduce the speaker for today's lecture.
Thank you, Darika, and good evening to everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all on board this Peninsula Foundation event this evening, and a very important topic. So we have with us today Dr. Vijay Sakuja, who is an expert on, he focuses greatly on the maritime security areas and particularly in Southeast Asia, and now he's put his sights on Western Pacific, and that's an important area to actually look at. Dr. Vijay Sakuja, the former naval veteran, and he's obtained his doctorate from Jawaharlal Nehru University, from the Department of Disarmament Studies. He's a prolific writer. He's got about 40 plus books, edited volumes, authored books, and monographs, and a lot of experience. As we discussed, he's also consulting with ICWA, which is fairly extensive work with them. And then he's been director of Maritime Foundation. He's been research fellow with ORF, with IDSA, with CAPS. And of course, he's worked in Singapore at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. He's a research fellow there as well. So he's got a lot of experience, extensive experience, and good analytical approach to the issues of maritime security particularly. And of course, he's also focused on issues like for the fourth industrial revolution and technologies related to that. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Vijay. And I must mention here, Vijay is along with me, the co-founder of the Peninsula Foundation. He's part of our managing trustee team and is vice president, as Darika has also indicated. So it's great pleasure to have Vijay here with us this evening. And let me hand over to Vijay. You can start here.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me share the screen.
Yeah.
Have you got the screen, sir?
Yes. You go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. It's a pleasure to participate in this evening experts lecture series, and a subject, the geopolitics of the Western Pacific, is somehow very, very dear to me, in the sense that having sailed through these waters several occasions and then realized how important they were. My first visit was way back 1995, and that time South China Sea was just about getting heated up. And that time, just after we had sailed out of that region, it was the Taiwan Strait crisis, which followed, and thereafter it's not been an easy running for that region, in the form of some contestation somewhere or the other. And of course, so much has been written and talked about South China Sea. So I will be very briefly touching on South China Sea, but the focus would be to see as to what is this Western Pacific, what is this region. There's a tendency to look at the entire gamut of Indo-Pacific, which I'll talk about a little later. But it's one schema doesn't fit into every other schema, in the form of that what developments take place in the North Arabian Sea may not be very much a kind of, let's to be borrowed and brought into South China Sea, or South China Sea, vice versa. So I chose this particular topic, and I call it in one of my books, which is now coming out. It is on regional maritime security complexes, on Barry Bouzon's idea of regional RCT. But then before that, I realized that I must get into this region and see what it is all about. So I thought, it'll be something which, let me share this particular slide. This I prepared this morning, and this all happened last week. Very interesting. You have on the left-hand side, 6th of June, you have American senators, a military aircraft, and the cargo here is about 650,000 COVID vaccines in it. And sure enough, it attracted, after all, the Chinese are looking through a very fine microscope to see what the Americans do. And sure enough, we get a very interesting comment coming in from mainland China. They want to make the landing of C-17 in the island a fact that we must accept as a mainland, paving the way for the US and Taiwan to further escalate their collusion. This happened on 6th of June. Then, 2 days later, on the night of 8th and 9th, this is all happening this week. PLA strategic forces, they held a nighttime rocket training drill with its D-26 ballistic missile, also known as carrier killer, launched. Now, this was essentially, one were to look at it, it was just signaling that we don't like it. There's never been a US military aircraft landing over there after the Taiwan Strait crisis, and more particularly in recent times. And suddenly they are taken aback. Now you have of course, the American senators have been visiting and sometime or the other in Taiwan. But aircraft coming in and then again coming in on board with the senators, you find that the Chinese are literally upset. And the launch of this missile is is kind of a signaling which is going on. Simultaneously, this week itself, the PLA Navy conducted amphibious landing exercise in waters of South China Sea, the Fujian province overlooking Taiwan. Now, this is not a unique week. As a matter of fact, those of us who've been following this region very closely, we notice that this has been happening literally every week, every day. And for the last literally about 14 months or so, which I've been now monitoring on a daily basis, I find this is the order of the day. There is something or the other. As a matter of fact, I have a Google alert for this particular thing, and I find every day I have got enough fodder to think about, talk about, or write about. So this is the kind of shape of things which is going on. But before doing that, as the title of the subject, as we talked about geopolitics of the Western Ocean, I thought let's look at it this particularly narrowly within the broader context of the Indo-Pacific. Now, what is this Indo-Pacific that we are talking about? So much has been written, talked about. Every day there's a seminar or the other. I guess there'll be almost about 365 seminars on the Indo-Pacific happening only in India. Likewise, you would notice that this is such a popular subject, an important subject, and I would also venture to suggest is both fashionable as also desirable to talk about Indo-Pacific because that's the new flavor that we are talking about. So what is this Indo-Pacific? I call it as a popular spatial maritime littoral formulation. It encompasses, to me, it's about 4 A's: Asian, African, Australian, and the American. This is the kind of maritime littoral space that we are talking about. So much is talked, as I said, in terms it has appeared in the white papers, strategy documents, doctrines. Everybody is talking about preparing for it. As a matter of fact, we see, as we talk a little later, that the Europeans too are into this region. So nobody is now being deprived of the flavors, as you would put it in culinary art, flavors of the Indo-Pacific. So we see that appear in the policy documents, speeches, interviews, conferences, joint statements, summit speeches, summit statements, everybody is talking about. But it has varying imaginations, interpretation, and cartographic limitations. How we look at in New Delhi, look at the Indo-Pacific, we do look towards the west, towards the east coast of Africa. But then, Australians would shy off just with India. Similarly, the Americans would also shy off towards just about India. Japanese look beyond. Earlier, we also had this concept of AAGC, Asia Africa Growth Corridor. So each one has its own kind of interpretation of what kind of space that they're looking at. What I find that over the last years, when we held our first conference on the Indo-Pacific, that time I was the research director at the Indian Council of World Affairs way back in 2012. Over the years, since then, I've seen that the whole concept of Indo-Pacific has gone through I call it a mutation of existing formulations. And this is all mutation is happening based, primarily driven and led by national interest. What I find is a alphabet soup. Or in that part of the world, they call it alphabet soup. And I'll venture to suggest, I think we've got an alphabet curry here. We started with something for the Western Pacific that I'm going to talk about, Pacific Rim. We changed over to Pacific Asia. We followed it up as an Asia Pacific. Then we have turned to Indo-Pacific. There's someone who talks about Indo-Asia Pacific. The Indonesians prefer it called as Pac Indo. The Africans, who we got a chance to discuss all these issues, they said, what about us? They said, why can't it be Afro-Indo-Pacific? Then there's Indo-West Pacific, Indo-Pacific Asia. So you notice that this alphabet curry that we have got, or this coinage that we got, it is going through a mutation of sorts depending on their national interest. They are driven by, some conceptualizing, like Japanese will call it confluence of the oceans. The Indians would call it civilizational connection. Chinese call it the Maritime Silk Road runs through it. The Indonesians prefer Global Maritime Forum. For us, again, in India, Project Mawsum. Then you have other things which are coming up, which I'll talk a little later. FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific. And these are all flavored with more set of adjectives of sorts, if I may use the word. Rule of law. ASEAN says centrality. Everybody says open, stable, secure, and prosperous. Somebody's talking about the Americans prefer freedom of navigation, rule of law, rule-based development. Somebody's talking about Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative. So you have a variety of these things coming up here. So to my mind, it's going through it's a work in progress. Indo-Pacific is a work in progress. We still don't know what exactly Indo-Pacific would be. And I'll argue a little later. It is not just security. Indo-Pacific today, in the concept part of it, we talk about global supply chain. We talk about Indo-Pacific in terms of pandemic. We talk about in terms of technology, 5G, 6G, 7G as it follows up. We are talking about infrastructure development. So Indo-Pacific is not just a security prism. So as we widen our understanding of Indo-Pacific, as a matter of fact, tomorrow when I get up, I wouldn't be surprised tomorrow, somebody gets up from say Punjab and say, what about chicken tikka from the Indo-Pacific or for the Indo-Pacific? So it is going through a massive, a complex kind of mutation of sorts of the Indo-Pacific. Now, if what I've chosen today is the Western Pacific, as I said in the beginning, Barry Bozon, regional security complexes, he begins with South Asia. One can divide the whole Indo-Pacific in several regional security complexes, such as one could have even North Arabian Sea or Arabian Sea regional security complex. You could have Indian Ocean security complex, Bay of Bengal security complex. You could have Southern Ocean security complex. Of course, then you can even have, for that matter, Western Pacific security complex. And that is what I'm going to talk about. And I've just tried to put out to you that this is the geographic space or the maritime littoral space that I'm going to play around this whole game on this canvas, so-called the Indo-Pacific. But it is probably today in the 21st century, I would certainly argue, it is the most contested region in the 21st century. Surely enough. Most militarized, 6 of the world's 10 largest militaries, 4 nuclear weapon capable nations. And if this be the combination, there's a conventional nuclear combination, then you would notice that suddenly the temperatures go up, down, they cool down, they build up again. There are enough triggers to create so-called security dynamics. There's political tension, there's diplomatic overtures, diplomatic understandings, exchanges, military. We have not reached that stage where we're going to fire, we're short of war, but certainly the tension's high. Then there are economics. You already have, you're familiar with the US-China trade war. As a matter of fact, India-China also in terms of trade issues. All right. Then we have tensions in terms of technology transfer, technology stealing, etc., etc. These are the coinage which has essentially we are going through a very complex and unstable security dynamics which is at play. Aggressive posturing, naval exercises. We already have 2 carrier operations going on. And soon we're going to see more carriers coming in. The French are already sailed through. All right. The British are coming. They're on the way. All right. We have freedom of navigation operations going on. Their air part display. I'll talk about this a little later. All right. Military infrastructure buildup. So what we are witnessing is an intense great power rivalry between the US and China. And then rest of the nations, whether it's the EU, whether it is India, Australia, Japan, are all gravitating, are in a flux of sorts that they're tying up. They also have their interest keeping trade going with Chinese, as also trying to build up. As a matter of fact, you find that we are on the verge of, we are just there on that particular thin, let me say, a line in which we we are skewing ourselves towards the Americans or towards the Chinese, some towards the Chinese. So it's a rivalry which probably is reminiscent of what was being played out during the Cold War. Now let's look at this. As I said, the center of gravity is this maritime littoral space. I put out three graphics over here. All right. It starts, to my understanding, and I'm taking from the American point of view. And if we were to take from the Indian Ocean point of view, we can still move that towards the Western Pacific, but we not so much contested as it is from the Pacific. All right. We talk about a corridor or an axis of or even a kind of a, let's say, a larger space. All right. Hawaii, Guam. You can see Guam here. Hawaii is further down here. See the last picture that I've got my cursor on. All right. Then China's first island chain. Sorry, first the second island chain, then the first island chain, and close to the Chinese coast along the Taiwan Straits. So these two, the two pictures of the graphics on either side, on the ends of the screen, you would notice you're getting a good idea. This is the littoral space or the maritime littoral space in which this contestation is taking place. And the middle one is a very interesting. I picked it up on the net again. By the way, all the pictures are from net. Several of them may be copyrighted, and it is only for the purpose of such sharing of information or exchange of ideas. These are not for commercial purposes. So here you notice that how the forces are pitted, the Americans are moving up, as we'll see a little later in another slide. So what you have here is a very fascinating kind of a space in which there is contestation, there's politics, there is diplomacy at play, then there is technology denial regimes are on, then there is also in terms of economics, trade, commerce, foreign, freedom of navigation, safety of sea lines of communication, not to forget. We're also talking about issues such as climate change. We're talking about issues such as environment and ecology. We're also familiar with ideas that South China is a fragile ecosystem in which there can be damages when all this is happening. All right. So this is all flavored with lots of. Then there is of course the HADR, humanitarian disaster relief, which come natural cyclones which happen, or the hurricanes in that part of the world as we would put them. So there is a lot which is happening over there. Now, both sides, that is United States and China, they brought to bear their respective military captives. I think there is a kind of display of sorts. I think we'd call them a 26th January display, which is on. They brought in the top of the line vessels, aircraft, fighters, they fired ballistic missiles. Everything is happening there as if they're preparing for it. High degree of military readiness, but short of war. But short of war. That's very, very important, right? This is at the same time keeping in mind that both China and the United States have a CBM or a maritime military CBM called the MMCA, Maritime Military Consultative Agreement, which probably they were to meet last December. They missed on it because each one started blaming each other and walked out. Suddenly, I find there are overtures now. They want to talk about things. So what's happening is there's a lot of restructuring going on. Restructuring, I mean, UN is also, the US is bringing in lots of forces. I'll talk about it a little later, called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. They're moving in some of the forces from the European theater. But then now there again, they're all stuck because there are issues of Syria, which is happening over there. Then there are issues of Ukraine. So Black Sea, for that matter, is very, very ripe. It is lots of things happening over there between the Russians and the European navies. There's also the Americans over there. So a lot of restructuring is going on, harmony to bring in redeployment of forces. Then there are military exercises, operations by carriers, as I said, 2 carrier operations. Strategic bombers are flying. Nuclear submarines have been deployed. Special forces operations are going on. President Joe Biden, he doesn't show any signs of relenting. There's a bipartisan consensus in Washington to challenge China's rise. And I think that comes out, which came out right, his draft US, as it says, US interim national security guidance. This was in March, just 2-3 months ago, where he talks about China. Then look at President Xi Jinping. No signs of backing off. He signaled his continued focus on his China dream, that is 2049, right? March towards becoming a major regional power, despite pushback from the US. So both the sides have now exhibited enough at the political level, at the diplomatic level, at the military level, at the economic level, at the strategic level, that they are not just backing off. Things are not changing, although we've had some discussion, some kind of, let's say, conversation which is on between the two sides. As far as the economy is concerned, we've also had some discussion as far as the military commanders level. Also, some discussion has taken place, all right, but not much. But are those the beginning of both sides trying to relent? I don't think so. I think the stage is set. And so stage is set for a kind of, let's say, a competitive regional security dynamics, that is the Western Pacific. Now, I briefly mentioned about what is the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. The US had set up a European Deterrence Initiative. That was because of issues in Crimea, then issues in Ukraine, and they had mobilized a lot of forces. But 2019, the US announced the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. This is concerning fiscal support for military activities and associated infrastructure investment plan in the Pacific. Mind you, they may have deployed forces. As we'll see a little later, you also need to build up associated infrastructure. You just don't bring ships. You have to base them. They're forward deployed. There are going to be logistic issues. There are going to be issues of how to put the human resources, maintenance. Such large aircraft are going to be operating in the region. It all requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of infrastructure. So US has announced they have given a high priority, and I find this morning I was reading very interesting. The US defense budget, military budget, is they have allocated about 22.6% to the Navy. As a matter of fact, when we talk about the Navy, they're also talking about a lot of fundings coming in for the purpose of the Marines, which are forward deployed. They're going to be for the Air Force. So you have a lot of, let's say, restructuring within the US defense budget towards the Pacific, when Pacific Deterrence Initiative is the one which is going to, it targets China. And the aim is, PDI's aim is to win through strategy, capacity, capabilities, and budget priority. Four focus areas: joint force lethality. We're talking about distributed operations, variety of complex issues, which I'll not talk about as of now. Maybe if you're interested, you can read it. For design and posture, a new kind of force structure. Strengthen allies and partners, very, very interesting. This is what we're going to talk. And exercises, experimentation, and innovation. This is very, very interesting. I noticed in the whole PDI is about innovation. That is where Industry 4.0 is making inroads into the force design and posture, or for that matter, operations or strategy, capacity, capabilities. Aim to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open against any attempts by China to dominate regional security matters, prevent intimidation of Taiwan, and reassure countries who have disputes with China in the South China Sea. 6th of March, Admiral Davidson's testimony. Without convincing conventional deterrent, China will be emboldened, unilaterally changing status. I think that says it all. They know it. They are into competition with China, who is building up a large military capability. It's an economic power, right? It's got a lot of political and diplomatic clout, right? It's got a lot of money in it with it, and it is able to put all those kind of, let me say, the yuan or the dollars or the euros that it has in its kitty, put to good use. Imagine just BRI itself is so many $1 trillion worth of a massive project. Now let us look at this. As I said, they're reinforcing their bases. Here you see a picture inset into it is Guam. Now here they're going to invest a lot. They're talking about 360-degree protection. And if you see, Guam is well within the range of DF-21 and DF-26. We talked very briefly earlier about DF-26, the first slide. All right. Then you, of course, Hawaii is there towards the extreme right. You would notice they already got, this is a full-fledged naval base. Those of us who've been there, a fascinating place. All right. This was what was attacked during Second World War. Right. And then there are other, these small little, you see those boxes over there? That is where, Saipan, Pagan, Tininan, right? Now, these are the places where the Americans had used these during Second World War. Now they are being reinforced. small little airstrips are being expanded, reinforced. Radar infrastructure is coming up. So they are trying to build up a kind of a shield, or maybe ballistic missile defense, all right, cruise missile defenses, right? And all this is coming in because the Chinese ranges, if you see, of the missiles, 16,000 kilometers, 1,500 kilometers, 2,150 kilometers, 4,000 kilometers, they're all reaching up. And let's not forget, it's just purely shore-based missiles, all right? And there are missiles that are carried on board submarines. We're going to be further up toward into the Pacific. They're not going to be operating in this particular region only. They're going to be further up. So you find that the US is now building up this whole area, and the kind of buildup is very, very impressive and aggressive. You have, of course, you have Japan, you have South Korea. These are the facilities that they can access. Philippines, I'll talk about them a little later. And then, of course, Darwin here in Australia. So you find that there is a push towards the west by the US. Then there's a pushback from China towards the east, towards the United States. So Pacific, so-called, as we go back to our previous slide where we talk about first island chain, Hawaii, Guam, second island chain, first island chain, right? Chinese coast through Taiwan. This is the region that we're talking about, is now very, very attractive. Both the sides have invested a lot of capability into it. All right. Things are get tense very, very often, as we see this week itself, we've seen so many developments. As a matter of fact, they've been crisscrossing each other into somebody carries out an exercise, the other one is sitting and shadowing what's going on. So, and of course, there is always this so-called uh, cutting into the ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone of Taiwan by the Chinese. So this is all happening over here. It is alive, live, and it's happening here. Let's look at this. That was what we talked about infrastructure. Now look at the same thing, how the Chinese systems are laid out along the coast, cruise missile systems, Hainan down there, Spratlys, they build up over there. Then every day, you get new inputs. 2 days ago, we found that they had deployed a Y-8 aircraft, a surveillance aircraft that was on one of the islands. Right. So every time they're building up a little facility, they're testing out their maritime surveillance aircraft, fighter aircraft, staging posts, whole lot of things. Then there is you have the Japanese operating the F-35, right? The Koreans are also building up. We'll talk a little later about that. The Philippines have now gone into they've really upgraded themselves. They've had their own fair share of discomfort with the Americans, but they're now back into business. And right in the middle, you see Guam, US Carrier Group. So this is just a kind of glimpse of what was actually happening or has been happening. And I dare say that it will be happening in the future. I don't see things change. It is continue going to be happening like this. You see on the right hand side, 3,300 kilometers H-6K bombers, the F-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles. Now all this is happening. The aircraft in the air, submarines underwater, right? Missiles which are going to be. Is it as if there is some kind of preparation for war which is now, I have this small little pictures here, and I want to see if you look at the first picture on the left hand side. This again, DF-21 and DF-26. You see them; these two, they were fired last August, right? And not August, rather September, October, I would say, right? That was the time when the Malabar 2 was taking place in the North Arabian Sea. This is very, very fascinating issue. Missile firing is a tool of, as I said, strategic communication to signal to the Quad of its military capability. And now, as we said, that 2 days ago, they fired yet another. So DF, these carrier killer missiles will be the ones which will be used for strategic communication, that you're crossing the red lines. It was a warning to the Quad that what you are venturing into is not in the interest of regional stability as far as their schema of things is concerned. And Admiral Philip Davidson says, China will test more missiles, conventional and nuclear-assisted missiles this year than every other nation added together on the planet. So it's as if a huge number of missiles are going to be flying. Huge number of deployments will be taking place. Huge anti-missile defense capabilities will be put into operations and display. So there is, we're just, as I said, we're short of war, not the war, right? But no war either. This is the kind of game which will continue. And I think both sides are also conscious of the fact that they don't want to trigger a war because they want to build in certain mechanisms. And it is not in the interest of the Chinese, nor is it in the interest of the American, or for that matter, the whole region itself, to get into any kind of a skirmish which leads to a war. So they'll come close to each other, shy away, walk away, carry out the strategic communication, signaling, whole lot of things that go on into this. And you're familiar with the strategic literature in which each one is trying to test the other. It's not going to be who's going to chicken out, but it is, we have the things going on, but we will not get into it. I think the MMCA, which is now being revved up, which will be revived, which has been put into cold storage for a while, is now being brought back into business.
Mhm.
Now, all this is happening. It's not happening in vacuum. US has security alliances, their guarantees, visiting forces agreement, and partnership. I'll talk about a few things here. Right? US has set up a complex network of formal security alliances with Japan and Korea. We're all familiar. This goes on post-World War. These have endured, and notwithstanding pressures from domestic constituencies, every time we used to hear about Okinawa, there's a problem. Americans go back, right? This was the so-called the jargon, not the jargon, rather this was the call, right? Americans go back. We don't want you here. Americans would then redeploy their forces. As a matter of fact, they're now trying to redeploy their forces from Okinawa and bring them into Guam. That's why they're building up infrastructure. Korea, again, the same story. And when President Trump came into as the president, he was pressurizing them to pay fair share for the nuclear umbrella. This
Mhm.
was the pressure on them. But then they realized, I think under President Biden, I think this is a passe. Current circumstances, particularly the threat from China, and the near continuous dangers of missile launches by DPRK preclude such things. I think the Americans have said to the idea, no, we got to be there. Plus, this is they're going to be their so-called center of gravity of operations. This is where the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is going to be, where much of their 22.6%, at least for the Navy, if I'm saying, the budget is going to move. All right. So the focus is that is where the competition is going to be. So they are moving in. So for that, to that extent, Japan and Korea are very, very significant for the Americans. Senkaku Island, Japanese have their own problems. Japanese are promoting, as a matter of fact, I should say they're leading free and open Indo-Pacific vision, offer a common strategic umbrella that provides attractive utility for other states. Japan is leading proponent of the QS. They're very vocal under Prime Minister Suga. I think every speech is got nothing else but QSD, is nothing else but FOIP. So they are very much engaged in the region. They see it. They're trying to build up capacities, say in Vietnam. They're building capacities in Philippines. Right? They're also building their own capacities. New platforms are under commission. They're building up a variety of surveillance on these islands in Okinawa, Miyakojima, and Yonaguni. And of course, Okinawa stays alive to them. And not to forget, Senkaku carry out exercises. Similarly, ROK, Republic of Korea, somehow, their absence from the QSD is noticeable, represents a glaring weakness in Washington's Indo-Pacific coalition building effort. But if you see the picture, I think they just had this very interesting meeting. We pledge to maintain peace and stability, lawful unimpeded commerce, and respect for international law, including freedom of navigation overflight in the South China Sea and beyond. But that's just, I think the American, the Korean focus is still on North Korea. They are uncomfortable. At the same time, they also don't want to antagonize the Chinese. But then let us see how it unfolds, how this meeting goes on. How does it unfold? How these two leaders now, the Koreans, the Americans under the new American leadership, how do they transact business now? How much Korea will be drawn into the US's Indo-Pacific strategy? It still remains to be seen. Whereas in the case of Japan, we are very, 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 very clear as to what exactly it means. I come to this. I think the one country, right? We call it a country, of course. They have a flag, right? Although they're not part of the UN. All right, Taiwan. Now, I'm not going to go into the history, but I'm going to come back to you just for the last 5 months. What's happening? 2000, early this year, a bipartisan commitment to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act. make sure that Taiwan has the ability to defend itself and to make sure that we are sustaining peace and security in the Western Pacific. We stand behind those commitments. That the US continues to maintain a credible posturing involving naval and air exercises whose frequency, intensity, and quality has improved significantly in recent times. This is one statistics I want to share with you. January till 16th of April, right, 3.5 months, China sent 257 jets, mainly J-10s and 16s, into Taiwan's ADIZ on 75 days, roughly 5 days every week, or an average 3.4 aircraft per day. Now you can well imagine if 5 days a week, 5 working days if you were to look at, you had 3.4, 3.5 aircraft floating in the air. And the Chinese have been on the stand too, on a high degree of readiness. They've been chasing them away. This is the kind of tension which is going on in the Taiwan Strait. It's just not the Taiwan Straits. It is also on the east of Taiwan. PLA Navy has been carrying out exercises that area. Along the coast, the Chinese have been carrying out amphibious exercises. There are missile firings which go on. I think you can well imagine that what would be going on in Taiwan. Continue. I think they are 24/7. April 12, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken warning that it would be a serious mistake for anyone to try to change the status quo on Taiwan by force. I think the lines are very, very clear. Both sides have the red lines drawn. Fortunately, those red lines are not meeting up in the form of that there's a clash. But this is the shape of things. What it is. Now let's look at this. South China Sea, very, very interesting. Reams of paper have been written on this issue. But the US had remained silent for a long, long time. It's only recently when they found that their focus was towards the Western Pacific, the competition is on, that they started to make statements about South China Sea, but not so strong statements. They thought it was useful to keep that it's a bilateral issue between the claimant states, that is Vietnam, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia. They let them resolve their own issues. We're not going to get into it. All right. It's only last year that they came out with a very, very strong paper and a statement to say US policy for the South China Sea, and the statement reads, world will not allow Beijing to treat the South China Sea as its maritime enterprise, and Washington has rejected China's claims for offshore resources in most of the South China Sea. You must also look at it from, then it goes on to say, US's position over South China Sea presents complex challenges and a perennial dilemma for who to choose for the ASEAN. Right. Here, if we were to look at this, first is the 2016 award, Philippines award. All right, on South China Sea. 9-line dismissed. Chinese claim excessive expansive. And I think that was also one of the triggers for the US, although US is not ratified, signed, but not ratified the 1982 UNCLOS. But then, it's only now last year that you find the US statement has come out. Now, this is a very interesting thing which has happened this Monday, this week. Special ASEAN-China Foreign Ministers meeting. They celebrated 30th anniversary of dialogue relations. Relations elevated to comprehensive strategic partnership. And such partnership is only enjoyed by the EU. And the issue on the South China Sea again comes up. This is about code of conduct. Declaration on the code of conduct to parties in the South China Sea agreed to resume the second reading of the second draft code of conduct in the South China Sea negotiating text and working for early conclusion of negotiations. Now, this code of conduct for South China Sea between ASEAN and China should have been completed this year. They should have come out with it. But then, because of pandemic, a whole lot of issues, it has not happened. But what merits our attention here is, it is a code of conduct between China and ASEAN. That is, who have claims over territory. But then it is not just about South China Sea, it's not about just territory. There are issues of freedom of navigation, safe commerce. As a matter of fact, there is already a silent murmur of sorts which is taking place which talks about why not us in the so-called the draft code of conduct, because we also have stakes in it. The Americans, the Brits, why not Indians? We are not yet talking about it, not to antagonize China. The Australians are talking about it. The Japanese are talking about it, that they have stakes in it, in the region. So when you talk about a code of conduct, if it is going to be large global commons, they must be aware of it, they must participate in it. They should be able to say, have their say into it. So this is something which is now brewing up and which will be again a pressure point, which will be on China because they would now like to do it very, very quickly. Get it off the back, off the shelf. Otherwise, we are not going to get a code of conduct on the South China Sea. Now, Philippines, and this statement says it all. An armed attack against the Philippines armed forces, public vessels or aircraft in the Pacific, including in the South China Sea, will trigger our obligation under the US Philippines MDT, Mutual Defense Treaty. Period. And in April 8th, it says it very clearly. After a lot of discussion, debate, etc., between President Duterte and also the military, the diplomat, the whole bureaucratic establishment, foreign policy establishment, right? We find that the MDT is now shaping up. As a matter of fact, the Americans are keen to take on one of the shipyards, which was also being, there was a competition which was coming in from the Chinese also. I think they're going to give it to the Philippines military, who are now going to get in the Americans to get into it. All right, and start building, warships and assets over there. So the Americans are now committed into Philippines. Vietnam offers us a very, very interesting story. Now, their policy is very, very clear. No military alliance, the four no's they call it. As the Japanese call three no's. Four no's, no military alliance, no affiliation with one country to counteract the other, no foreign military bases in the Vietnamese territory to act against other countries, and no force or threatening to use force in international relations. Very, very interesting if you see this. It's all four no's. One would venture to suggest after, they've had a very bad history in terms of US Vietnam, the war, etc., etc. There's been thaw in relationship, variety of things have taken place. Economics growing, bilateral trade is fantastic. All right, they were labeled last time as fraud country in terms of currency manipulation, but that they've been taken off that, etc., etc. But the Vietnamese are in no mood whatsoever to appeal to the Americans. They are not interested in Indo-Pacific. My interaction with them suggests we are not interested in Indo-Pacific. They're not even interested in India's Indo-Pacific Ocean Sea. They just don't abhor the whole idea of a quadrilateral security dialogue. And this is the General Deputy Defense Minister, he's now retired. He says, Americans often ask me why Vietnam-Cuba relations are so good. Very interesting narrative he builds up. Don't think that ignoring Cuba would make the Americans treat us well. Having tensions with China would win American support. Or closing our doors to the US would make China talk to us less harshly. It's a real, what I would call as a good example, a fantastic example of strategic autonomy. I will choose what I put. It says it all. And for that matter, of course, on both sides, China and Vietnam, the party engagements are fantastic. All right. There is always this exchange which takes place between them. All right. So you find that Vietnamese are not going to play ball with the Americans. They're not going to play American ball with the Chinese. They're going to push their whole idea about preserving themselves, protecting their whole interest in East Sea as the what the Chinese call South China Sea, or we call South China Sea. For them is East Sea, and similarly, the Philippines call the South China Sea as West Sea. I come to this very interesting. It's a busy slide, and I'm going to spend little time on this. I've used the word mutation once again. The whole Indo-Pacific, I said, is under mutation. New coinages. I call that alphabet curry, which is now brewing up. And early this year, the first picture is the four leaders of the quadrilateral security zone. I'm not going to talk about QSG, what it is, etc. You're all familiar with this. Then the three pictures, right? There's no President Biden in this. The third one, you have Trump, of course, one can replace with President Biden. You can replace uh, the Japanese Prime Minister with Prime Minister Suga, right? Then the Australian. Now, if you see what is happening, there's a foursome, there's a threesome, there's another threesome. Now, what is happening is that they are conducting their business collectively four, sometimes collectively three, sometimes another three. So new multipolarity is beginning, or it is the beginning of a new Cold War of sorts. That means we wouldn't like to be getting involved in this Cold War, right, which is pitted against China. Australians are very much sure that they want to get into it. And what these people are doing in this mutation of sorts, that is Quad minus one or two, or Quad plus one and two, huge networks have come up. Blue Dot Network. This is a network involving US, Australia, and Japan, in which they talk about building up infrastructure, quality infrastructure. And this is essentially to counter the BRI. Five Eyes Signal Intelligence Network is an old network, but then it has been revved up now. India is not part of this. Then there is Resilient Supply Chain Initiative. We're talking about Australia, India, and Japan talking about this. That is supply chains. After post-pandemic, post the reliance on China for various commodities, etc., etc. They talk about RSCI. Then there is a very interesting one: digital connectivity in 5G. Japan, Australia, UK, and India are trying to say, okay, we'll have built up our own. As a matter of fact, the 5G debate is going on. As a matter of fact, today, as an aside, I must say, the Chinese are already way ahead now, moved up the ladder as far as 6G is concerned. Hopefully, another 7-8 years from now, they'll be fielding the 6G. Supply chains for rare earths too, because they don't want to rely totally on the Chinese. They're investing in Taiwan. New industries are coming up, or industries are coming up from Taiwanese are now, chip manufacturers are investing in, want to invest in the United States. Then there is space technology and launches. So India is now inviting others to join in. So what we are seeing is Quad minus one or two, Quad, a different combination. There is Quad 1, 2, and 3. Now, when I talk about Quad, we've seen here Quad plus 1, that is UK joining in. All right. 3 is another combination we are talking about. If you really look at it, we're talking about the Brits coming in, we're talking about the Australians joining in, all right, and the French joining in, the other European nations coming in. So you find a kind of mutation is gone. Quad is not to be looked purely from a strategic prism, purely from a military prism, but we must start opening our minds to it that Quad will be not a NATO, certainly not a NATO of sorts, or the Chinese, as we'll talk on the next slide. But then there is a combination which is going on. And all this is now being flavored with three more developments, which are now FOIP, which is the Japanese, of course, they talk about free and open Indo-Pacific. India, though part of the Quad, and that Quad, as I said, is not just purely military, strategic, Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. And there are 7 pillars. They're all in terms of, one disaggregate those, they're all in terms of development discourse. Climate change, pandemic, you have critical infrastructure, variety of the connectivity issues are there. This is what the push of the today's South Bloc is, to look towards Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. Then there is the ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific. They want to retain their centrality. So what you're seeing is already a mutation of the Indo-Pacific. For some, it is strategy. For some, it is a development discourse. For some, it is going to be Indo-Pacific, in which they want to say they have a role in terms of ASEAN centrality. What you need, what you notice, and sum it up to say, is an eclectic blend of realism and constructivism. This is something very fascinating. Is it a sophisticated strategy? It's too early to say which way it will go, but certainly we will have to be playing a game very, very carefully to look at which prism do we go into, strategic, or we go into realist paradigm, or we do look at constructivism, in which there's plenty of space available to play. Let's look at what the Chinese are talking about. This is an Asian NATO, right? And they are unhappy with the Indo-Pacific strategy. And 2018, Prime Minister Yi Yang, he dismissed it. He says there is never a shortage of headline-grabbing ideas. He referred to Indo-Pacific. They are like the sea foam in the Pacific or Indian Ocean. They may get some attention, but soon they will dissipate. He dismissed it as sea forms. But then we'll have to see. But then we have our own foreign minister suggesting using words like Asian NATO, etc., is a mind game which people are playing. Do you find such kind of coinages, articulations in the speeches, statements, interviews, comments, which is talking about the whole lot is saying it's not a NATO, it has much more to it. The Chinese global times every day, the morning when they eat, drink, and sleep, they only talk about Indo-Pacific strategy as a containment strategy. So this is the kind of things that I. Now I thought it'll be a good idea to start looking at what is this so-called. We've seen the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. We've seen their partners alliances, etc., etc. We've also seen how these new mutations of Quad which are going on. And now let us see what is the capacity and capability which is being brought to into this flow into the Western Pacific. I've got this fascinating table on top. 2000, if you see, Chinese were only 110 vessels, and hoping they're already touching by 2020. If you see one in yellow, 360 vessels. You would notice if you look at the 2015 figure, they've added 45 vessels in 5 years. That is 9 vessels per year. All right. And look at that. That means almost nearly a month there's a new vessel coming. They're not small vessels. Their every tonnage is anything about 4,000 to 5,000 tons. They are bristling with weapons, sensors. They're forward looking, and there's a huge number that they come. Bigger platform, amphibious platform, helicopter carrying platform. They're literally, they can be pretty intimidating platform. I can only say that. And at some stage, they're talking about 230, when the US is thinking about 400 to some that figure. The Chinese would be around 425, but they'll be large vessels. Large vessels they're talking about. Or that, look at the Chinese, 360 ships and submarines with over 130 major air combat and power projection expeditionary capability. Carriers, 2 ski jump, 2 catapult, submarines, if you see that, I don't want to get into details. Carriers again, they're going to be investing a lot, but what worrying us, it is not the Chinese aircraft carrier which will sail through the Indian Ocean, but a series of this type 075 Yushan class, which will be sailing through the Indian Ocean very frequently, very, very frequently. Because the Chinese aircraft carriers will remain engaged against the American carriers who will be all, as we've seen, into the Pacific. Now, Chinese defense budget, we've got some very interesting figures. If you see the 2019 US, fantastic, $686.1 billion. China still, of course, we can't believe what the Chinese put out, 174. Just an as a side, I just want to put it, the Chinese marine economy, it's growing at 6.2%, all right, and builder countries receiving orders. China is leading. Again, after the pandemic, the ship construction is doing very well. Global orders are back into China. China is back on the road to building a huge capacity. Here is just not about building civilian vessels, but it is about building larger vessels for the PLA Navy. Now, this is another interesting, again, I'm repeating this. The issues here are, freedom of navigation operations, 85 military exercises with regional allies in 2019. That is, the Americans did it. So it's not just the Americans alone. They're coming up with their own allies, partners who are coming in. Deep multi-theater exercises, simultaneous maneuvers. This was fascinating to see. They can conduct this. Live firing drills have been the feature, at least for the last literally about 14, 15 months. As I did mention about firing of DF-21D and DF-26D. So what you see, China's naval strategy for the Pacific Ocean would be near seas defense, that is the first island chain, and far seas protection. That means they're going to be offensive within the first island chain. They have got capacities, and towards the second island chain, there'll be protection that is more defensive. This is how the Chinese are going to play out in the Western Pacific. I thought I'll just bring in a very interesting subject, and this is how the warfare will be fought in the future. And I think the Chinese have already begun to invest a lot into this. China views AI, artificial intelligence, critical to its future military. Next generation AI plans details strategy and outline goals for commercial and military activity. It is there. I mean, they are investing into AI, ML, cognitive computing, you name a technology, and the Chinese are there into it. Digital twinning, singularity, variety of things. 2020, they have gained parity with world leaders in AI. That's what they announced. There'll be a major AI breakthroughs in another 3-4 years. 2030 emerge AI as AI global leaders. And here you can replace AI with Industry 4.0. Very convenient. This is out of the so-called Chinese AI long cast plan. But then you can simply replace word AI, this coin, artificial intelligence, with Industry 4.0. PLA could graduate into a digitalized force capable of 4IR enabled in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance and combat operations and logistics support. So you will have a PLA Navy with all the platforms, which will be 4IR enabled. Now you can well imagine who they are competing with. Of course, the competition is going to be coming from the Americans and, of course, a bit from Brits who are now exercising, bringing in a lot of AI into their military operations, right? And the French and no one else. They are the ones who are going to be leading it. Most of the contestation will be between the United States and China, and this will be led by AI driven, or for that matter, I should use the word Industry 4.0. This is something, another graphics I just want to give you an idea about. If you see the first infographic, 2016, the Chinese fished out a US surveillance drone out of the sea. A lot of tensions between the two sides. How did you do it? Law of the sea was brought in, diplomacy was at play, politics were at play. And you see, 2020, this is the Americans have made their own vessel called Sea Hunter. And this is the vessel which has already made some, is unmanned, right? And you see, of course, this is on trials. This is unmanned vessel which has made a very long voyage, west coast of, the east coast of, no, west coast of the United States through the Pacific towards Hawaii. They've done that. Another vessel is carrying out trials. But the Chinese also brought in their uncrewed surface vessel, USC, almost similar. They're mirror images of sorts, but this is what they're investing in. Now look at this. The Americans, this is the kind of the module that they fished out, and then they produce their own. Again, ASWUUVs, the Americans, the Chinese, the Koreans. And this is UAV capable of forming intelligence swarm and launch coordinated attack. I mean, there is swarm technology, a whole lot of things are going on. As far as the Chinese are concerned, they've taken the lead. Now, let's look at this particular line. The Americans came out with their own so-called electromagnetic railgun. The Chinese have brought in theirs. All right. Then they have talked about hypersonic cruise missile. The Chinese have it. Lasers and ESAT weapons. So what you see is Americans come out with something, right? The Chinese are also there. We don't know the sophistication level of the Chinese as yet, but certainly what we get to see is that they are trying to build their own weaponry, their own characteristics. Good, bad, ugly, we don't know as yet, but then this is what they're competing with Iran. And no one else is coming anywhere close to it. So they're the ones who are going to play it out with all these fancy toys that they're building up. All right, railguns, hypersonic cruise missiles, lasers, and ASAT. And the Chinese have been accused of using lasers, of course, in Djibouti earlier, and now they've been also accused of using lasers, shipborne lasers, for towards the US aircraft. Now, again, there are international conventions for it, but then who cares kind of a stuff, right? So here you find that there is a competition which is going on, which is of a high end, in which the US is progressing, the Chinese are progressing. Now, a quick assessment will be in order. The Chinese Navy remains committed to robust AI-led naval modernization. It's going to field advanced weapon sets of C4ISR capabilities. It's going to be anti-access, anti-denial, build solid, robust ones within first island chain and planning capabilities of operation concept for offensive in the second island chain, which will be again defensive in nature. Capability improvement, right? We're going to see strategic forces for targeting moving targets over land. We talked about T21, 26. Robust logistics, basing infrastructure to project sustainability power in the Indo-Pacific. Now, just to give an idea, this is not a, my purpose is not to promote my book, which came out in January this year. This is about four industrial revolution technologies, maritime and naval operations. My conclusion was among the number of conclusions that I had for my after I finished my book. There is urgency among the Quad navies to gain ascendancy in 4IR to obtain a favorable naval balance of power. Now, this is Quad I've used very selectively here because there is an investment which is going on from the Brits, not the Brits, sorry, the Australians are very keen. The Americans, of course, they're leading it, all right. Then the Japanese are also building up, all right. Indians are also talking about. So when I look at these, I try to put all these navies. Just I've got to put this matrix of just three navies. US Navy, I've got a yes, yes, yes on top. Policy, strategy, force structure, training and exercises, budget, and industrial technology development. PLA Navy, I haven't come across any, kind of a citation that they've had a typical exercise led by AI-enabled warfare kind of a stuff. I haven't got that as yet, but certainly they're also at par with the Americans in that context. But for us, I think it's not a very good story. I think probably we'll have to look at, because I conclude by suggesting the 21st century sea power could be led by super intelligent artificial intelligence. That is where we got to look. Our whole concept, the whole concept of sea denial, sea control, I think it's time that we start looking at sea denial, sea control, but led by Industry 4.0. Now, we've been doing this, very interesting, lots of accolades for the Navy. They call it mission-based deployments. 7 of these, they maintain their continuous presence. The aircraft are up in the air, all right, submarines underwater operating, ships in operations. And then this is what happens. We have the Indian Ocean covered from Gulf, that is Gulf defense and deployment, that is in the Persian Gulf, to Malacca deployment. We can see every Chinese vessel, most certainly. Indian Navy tweeted 50 ships on vigil 24/7 in our area of responsibility. Fantastic. I think this is a huge, one must give a lot of credit to the Indian Navy for the purpose of ISR and keeping presence 24/7. All that matters a lot. But we must also now start rethinking in terms of the PLA Navy may reconstitute composition of future task forces that are bound for the Indian Ocean. By my understanding, I'm very, very clear on this, you will not see usual Chinese task forces coming in. It will be led by helicopter carriers, cruise platforms, amphibious platforms. They're going to be moving in, carrying aircraft, all right. They'll be conducting exercises and operations involving UAVs, drones, AI-enabled underwater platforms. This is going to complicate our so-called the deployments that we talk about. And the force advantage that we enjoy, the Indian Navy enjoys, right, I think would be under stress. That's all I can say on that. Finally, this is my last slide. Over the last couple of months, or rather, let me put it last year, since last 2019, when the pandemic started, China has been accused over human rights abuses against Uyghurs, Muslim groups. This has been a recurring feature, as a matter of fact, before that also. Crackdown on Hong Kong pro-democracy campaigners. We've seen Hong Kong lose its status. And of course, the current debate on COVID-19 from China. They're under pressure, huge amount of pressure. China's diplomats have been undiplomatic and pursued a wolf warrior strategy and confrontation and even directly attacking foreign governments. I think they've come under a lot of flack for this. And this is on 31st May. Xi Jinping tells everyone it is necessary to make friends, unite and win over the majority, and constantly expand the circle of friends when it comes to international public opinion. I think he's realized that they've messed it up a lot, and now there is something to be done about it. Plus, he's got to go back, and see what's actually happening. I think we've seen a brutal display or a blatant display of power naval power, air power, military power functioning. And even this week, we saw all this happen. It will continue. But I think this approach, I find there's a apparent shift in China's diplomatic effort and tells the story in a positive way. They want to repair that damage that has been done. But on the military front, this will be on political, diplomatic, cultural, economic diplomacy. But I don't see anything relenting from both the sides as far as military is concerned. I think I'll stop that there and come back on the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay. That's an excellent coverage, wonderful coverage with wide sweep. Bringing out all aspects of strategy, technology, and the entire dynamics of geopolitics that are going around in the Western Pacific. I will, invite people to ask questions. Before that, I'll just put up a couple of questions to Vijay, and we have about 20-25 minutes. And those of you who are ready with your question, you can also put it up on the chat box, and we will follow it up as we go along. Okay, Vijay, let me ask a couple of questions. One is quite obviously, as you've very rightly stressed, the emphasis for China is to dominate the South and East China Sea, the first island chain, and push the Americans influence out to the beyond the second island chain positively. And in the larger picture, the Chinese are very clear, because when you read it across much of their literature and much of their strategic discussions, this is the military power in terms of technology and in terms of military capabilities are at the forefront to deter and push the American influence very clearly. But they're also aware that the war is not an option or not the right thing to do, and therefore they're combining that excellently with an objective. And your last statement, last slide actually says that very well, is to be able to influence rest of the world, to integrate the economies into a Sino-centric economic system, and that's the way they're going to displace the American power. So in the Western Pacific, you already pointed out, with 360 ships, out of which 73 submarines, and they are building at a tremendous clip. They'll be the largest navy by 2035. The American literature that I've seen, they indicate that they're not heading anywhere towards 400, but the Chinese would be beyond 400. And their literature also says a lot of emphasis on cooperation and collaboration between the PLAF and the PLAN, both the Air Force in their strategies. And that is evident in the Western Pacific. So is there any major observations and lessons to learn from that part with respect to, are we missing with respect to Indian Navy, Indian Air Force, and our approach to Indian Ocean? Are we missing, the writing on the wall completely?
Should we take a few, or should I respond to this?
Yeah. Just you can.
Should I respond to this? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I think this is a very interesting question, and I think probably I'm in the process of, as a matter of fact, I'll just give you some preliminary thoughts to it, because I'm in the process of I tabulated each of these exercises that were conducted. They come in sporadically, then you get input sporadically. So I'm trying to build up a picture of what was going on in the Western Pacific for the last 14 or 15 months. And I realized that it is very, very complex. The Americans have certainly mastered the art of bringing in the air forces and et cetera, et cetera. Guam was a very good example. And then even the Americans now are realizing that this so-called, let's say, joint operations, they've all gone into distributed maritime operations, which is not just purely in terms of that, it's just not that the two forces will come together for a particular scene and do it. They're already working on this so-called beyond the joint forces. And this is at display over there. And the Chinese too are doing the same thing. The way the Chinese were carrying out a lot of exercises, naval exercises in Taiwan Straits. The PLA Air Force was continuously, we got those very fascinating figures. That means that was scary in terms of the Chinese, for the Taiwanese who were wondering what was going on. All right. It was kind of a barrage. I think what they are multiple, let me, I don't want to use the word multiple, I want to say joint force of a different level altogether. And that is what is at display as far as the Chinese are concerned. I think a higher level. And let's not forget the Chinese have spent a lot of time trying to read up, understand, converse with the Americans. What are these joint operations? How do you conduct about it? Till very recently, the Americans were not suspicious of them. They learned a lot of things. They learned the carrier operations. So you find that they have reached a level where they're able to put out these forces. It's again, as I said, work in progress. They'll be mastering it over a period of time again and again and again. Americans have taken such a long time to build. So we're going to see a different kind of operations which the Americans are going to pursue. And right now, the Chinese focus is, of course, say, multi-service operations, or say, Army and the Air Force. You have paratroopers landing. We saw that as far as the Americans are concerned. The Marines came in from Alaska. They came into Guam, landing exercises. All right, the Navy's aircraft carrier operations going on. So you find that a lot of things were happening. The Chinese have also attempted that, but they've limited themselves till about the first island. They've not gone beyond that. And I mean, it'll be very interesting once I get full data. I'll be able to figure out what are the key issues that they were talking about, so-called, coordinated or multiplied operations that were going on. For us, I guess there's a huge lesson. We must start looking. The best way to read is because Americans, to that extent, I think, are reading the Chinese more than any one of us is doing here.
Yes.
They're not even, as a matter of fact, we find that we're not even discussing and debating what's happening in the Western Pacific on a daily basis.
That's right.
So there, if we were to find out what the Americans are doing, how they've gone about I'm not suggesting borrow the American model, but read up, understand, talk to them. What is going on? How do you going about this reorientation of your forces? Give us some cues as to how we can go about it. For us, the strategic geography need necessitates. I think the ANN. The other day I was reading somewhere, I think BARS, that is the airstrip in the Nicobar, is being expanded or something.
Yes.
All right. So we're going to see all this. So we'll have to build up all this. Bring in we are already acquiring, P8Is, but then ASW alone. I do understand that our aircraft have been moving into that Western Pacific, surely, staged out of Singapore or out of Guam, they've gone. Right? We know some of these bits keep coming out, all right? But that's about all. I think we'll remain, as a matter of fact, if we are talking about there's a pushback from the Americans for the Chinese, go back well within your first island. In a way, the Chinese have also given us a pushback. They've already done it. As a matter of fact, the moment they came out with Djibouti, we got stuck. We are now stuck. Mission-based deployment is, as a matter of fact, to my mind, is a very siloed approach. Nothing beyond Indian Ocean. I can't even think about it.
That's true.
So there is a kind of a new thinking, a disruptive thinking, if I may use the word, in how do we go about it? What new rules of the game in terms of we want to bring into play in terms of platforms, creative platforms, and they are not going to come with classic, Task Force 525 comes, 4 vessels coming in. I've got a huge list, 36 task force coming and going. We know for sure what they operate. The next they're going to come with, they will be 4 IR enabled platforms. They'll conduct exercises, much to our discomfort. Will be drone led. They don't need to fly big aircraft. Going to be the swarm operations. They're going to do that in the Arabian Sea. All right. And that will be very, very difficult for us. We won't know what to do. Literally. So a new thinking, what's going on. And as a matter of fact, swarming is now, I think, is turned into a basic activity. The non-state actors are doing it.
Yeah.
Right? Hamas is doing it.
Absolutely, I think the intelligentized warfare that the Chinese have put out actually says quite a lot of things. And you're right, both the Americans and Chinese are actually reading each other extremely well in the context of various strategies coming up. So one more question that I would say is we discussed the Cambodian, base approach. The Chinese, to be a global power, you need bases, overseas bases across. And of course, the Maritime Silk Road Initiative has that plan built into it. The Americans have 800 bases across the globe in any case. So, but they are aware of it. So in the West Pacific and the South and East China Sea, The artificial islands is the mechanism through which they are actually extending their reach. So with respect to the Cambodian, base, which I think is quite serious, it will probably be something like a checkmate to our Andaman Nicobar plans. That could be a serious issue, isn't it? So that is something I would want
So,
your opinion on that.
I
And I
mean, Reem Naval
probably
Base,
a
I think.
question from others also. I would ask them to.
So, if we can take those also, then can I respond with that?
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah. Shall I ask the other questions?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Okay, so we have a question from Satish. How significant is China's investment in its domestic semiconductor industry? For example, its huge investment in SMIC. What impact can it make in their proposed technology dominance plan? That's one. And second is, I think Sakshi had raised her hand. Those of
Yes.
yeah,
Hi.
go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Good evening, sir. Thank you for that presentation. My question is with regards to China's disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. There have been a lot of reports that came out, I mean, by the UN and other independent sources about the proven natural resources in that region of natural gas and oil reserves. So my question is, I just wanted to get your perspective on that with respect to the disputes. How, because this has larger implications with regard to resource allocation, resource sharing between the other countries, as well as undersea explorations and mining and deep sea mining. So I just wanted to get your perspective and opinion on this. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Vijay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have with me now 1, 2, and 3 questions. First, about the Reem Naval Base. Now, Reem Naval Base in Cambodia. The Americans tried very hard to put up a small little training sheds, if I may use the word, right, and to train the Cambodian Navy. The relations were good; they allowed it, but things were building up in terms of pressures coming in from China. Chinese brought in a huge amount of investment into Cambodia. Cambodia needed it, right? They needed infrastructure, or one would say even that was part of the BRI, right? And Cambodians were more than willing to receive what the Chinese, the largest which the Chinese brought in. I think there was a huge sway. But the Americans have been probing them and prodding the Cambodians all along that this Reem naval base will be used by the Chinese. And as true, state in the sense, what should I say? Any state for that matter will not reveal till the last moment that whether it is a Chinese interest in it or Chinese want to use it, and they've been denying it for a long time. Even now, very recently, I think 2 weeks ago, the Cambodian government denied that there's any investment being made by the Chinese for the purpose of building a naval base over there. Reem naval base is being developed, but the Cambodians say it is only for their own purposes. Right? We still haven't seen much coming out, except that the area around the Reem naval base is being developed as a commercial hub, as a tourism hub, as an entertainment hub. And I find that having been to Cambodia a couple of times now, and the Chinese have invested in lot in terms of marine leisure industry. That is building up marinas, the hotels along the coastline, beaches, waterfronts. They have been investing in that. And they are hoping that this will provide them at some stage some facility of sorts. But then one would also keep in mind that every commercial vessel facility is a facility. It's not a base. And to operate vessels, warships out of that base, requires a lot of infrastructure. We must make a clear distinction between a facility and a base. So Reem Naval Base, as of now, purely from the Cambodian parameters, is a small little facility. And the Chinese certainly will not be able to, they'll not put their ships over there because it'll require a huge amount of infrastructure. There's no any other Chinese assisted or Chinese for support for the Chinese, any base around. The closest that they can come to is absolutely into the Arabian Sea, into Gwadar or Karachi for that matter. So it will be, to my mind, it will be still a little early to label it as the Chinese naval base. Facility, yes, we've seen that happen as in the case of Guadar. It is still a facility. There's no naval base that the Chinese will be able to, but the Chinese warships are now coming in, but it has taken them almost about 20, 25 years to do that. Right? I would anticipate something like that, if not 25, 2.5 decades, at least 10, 12 years. But it depends how Korea, how Cambodia also response to them. There are already little problems which are going on. The Chinese have made deep inroads, which is again disturbing the social fabric. Right, casinos have come up, the social life is up, but then there is mafia. There are a whole lot of other issues which are going on in Cambodia. So people, there's a mixed bag. It depends on how the regime looks at it in terms of being driven towards the Americans now, because Americans are now asking that they will be happy to support as far as Mekong is concerned. Mekong is it's actually Lachang is the name of the river when it comes from China. Then when it enters into Southeast Asia, it becomes Mekong. So it becomes Lachang, Mekong. And there are huge issues about river water management, and they are unable to manage those in terms of they're trying, livelihoods are being lost. And if there is a question of livelihoods versus Chinese largesse, I think it'll be a very difficult choice for these countries. So already we are seeing that Cambodians fishing community. I've been to one of these rivers, the Mekong one section where the water is dried up, and as a matter of fact, what used to be deep water has turned into a floating village now. All right, they've lost their livelihood. They are complaining. All right. So what we find is that there'll be a balance which will be stuck between livelihoods from Mekong and the Chinese largest for this infrastructure, which again has a lot of socio-economic problems in terms of in the city, right? So this is how I would put the Dream Naval Base. As far as semiconductor, I think there is a pressure on, right? And we are, as I suggested, the Quad members are talking about resilient supply chains. The Chinese too are talking about resilient supply chains. They're also talking about their own manufacturing. After all, they're sitting in a huge, let's say, pile of rare earth. They are moving much, much ahead. Their industry is doing equally well. Borrow steel, or they've done the stealing part of it. They're doing exceedingly well. I think they'll be self-sufficient. There'll be many who will buy it, but we still don't know how this U.S.-China war, the military part of it, play out as far as economics is concerned, as far as technology is going to be concerned. It's still fluid. If we look at very narrowly for the say couple of say 1 or 2, 3 years, yes, they will be under a lot of duress in terms of building their own capacity. But we don't know how it will unfold because we already seeing exchanges going on between the two sides, US and China, over economics, trade, commerce, whole lot of things are coming up, right? So the Chinese are going to build their own capacities. As far as the East China Sea, South China Sea resource development is concerned, if you really go back, way back in 2002, they began with the whole idea about joint development, right? And it was something that was very much palatable. It was acceptable. Then suddenly they shifted. They said, no, now once you've got a nine dash line, it is all ours. What is mine, of course, and what is yours is also mine. It emerged that way. So there are lots of resources available, but still we don't have the accurate. And please remember, that time a lot of stress was on hydrocarbons. Yes, shifting slowly, 20, 30 years from now, hydrocarbons would be, I'm not saying gone. No, I think there is a new world altogether we're talking about. If you see the energy pie in the Chinese, of course, they keep importing the oil, gas keeps coming in, etc. Gas will be very important, but they're also looking at, non-conventional things. They're talking about solar, wind, tidal, hydrogen, right? Today we are already talking about vessels, smart vessels, which will be again, we are going to be talking about battery, which will be sail and solar, right? So a whole lot of combinations will be coming on. How much of reliance will be there? Even they're talking about putting up the UAVs, large UAVs, the solar panels, it will be able to radiate down. Whole conceptual ideas are going on. As far as these are the non-living resources, again, mining, again, will be very contentious. Who has the capacity and capability? And there's a new wave which is going on right now internationally. Stop disturbing the marine ecosystem. The green lobbies. Of course, China doesn't have that kind of a green lobby, but they talk about every day. They talk about new marine protected areas. They're also conscious. Right? So whether there'll be, but as far as living resources are concerned, fish will be a big issue. That will raise tension, and we've seen that that is how the fishermen are getting entangled into all this. That's why the maritime militia of the Chinese is coming. There's a mix of the maritime militia and the fishermen. Right? That is disturbing. They're talking about we don't no fish time zones. Right. The Philippines say no, for you it is not, but for us it is. And fish are migrating. So this is one area where as far as living resources are concerned, we're going to see a lot of tensions coming up. And there is no scope for joint development as far as fisheries is concerned. Chinese will remain hungry. They remain hungry. Right? There's no way that they're sharing off. As a matter of fact, suddenly they realized there was no supply of beef coming in from Latin America. The food is good. There was a time, I think it was Lester Brown when he wrote a very fascinating book in the 80s. He says, who will feed China? As well, today we are talking, China is able to feed itself. Yes, it is able to feed others also. But then things like soy will come from Latin America, maize will come from Latin America. The constant supply chains will continue. The food, etc., and raw materials, hydrogenated oils, etc., cooking oil, a whole lot of these things, palm oil, etc., they'll be keep importing. All right. So there will be a kind of fisheries will still remain contentious issue. But looking at the international regimes, we are talking about biodiversity. We are talking about maintenance of it. I think they will be precious. And China doesn't want to come out as marauders of the underwater domain or the maritime domain as far as living resources. So there will be a balance. But it's very difficult to say, no, this will not happen or this will happen. At this stage, it is too fluid and in a flux.
Yeah, thank you, Vijay. There are three questions which I'll just read out to you quickly. One is, of course, an interesting one from all of from people here were a couple of interns as well as the guests as well. So one is from Raja Pandian, who's asking what will be Russia's role or Russia's policy for this Pacific, which is an important question as I see it. Considering Kuril Islands, will they back China on that area? Okay, and second one is from Hari Chandrasekharan, who's saying his question is, what are the thresholds that could result in a military confrontation in the West Pacific? I think you can look at it, but much of your talk has already explained that. The third one is, of course, from Mohit. What's the significance or significant role of Beidou navigation system? Beidou 3 was operationalized last year, July. So I believe it has a very big role, and you can comment on that as well.
Okay, first let me talk about the Russian policy. Now, Russia, I think till very recently, Russians were not very keen what's happening in Western Pacific. They were more bogged down in the Black Sea. Or European theater was their main theater they were talking about. The deployment for very few vessels in the Indo-Pacific, towards the Vladivostok region, towards East Russia. But there is a realization that this is going to be central gravity. They have a lot of interests here, Vietnam particularly, offshore oil, right? And plus this new development in the terms of American pushback against China. The whole security architecture is now featuring into their schema. And when we talk to the Russian scholars, they do talk about these issues, all right? But they haven't had a position of sorts as far as South China Sea is concerned. There's no statement which says, no, this is going to be, because they cannot afford to antagonize China. At the same time, they cannot antagonize ASEAN. And if you start now looking at mapping the military hardware, particularly the Air Force hardware in this region, you find this, you can dot the Russian flag. It's all over. It's going to be dominant supplier of military hardware. It is coming in. The Americans have not been able to, because some people are still shy of. Look at Vietnam, Malaysia, all right? Indonesia is also thinking in terms of getting more. Myanmar, of course, Bangladesh. See, you can dot that. So the Russians as of now will be more driven by, and their focus as of now will be less on Indo-Pacific, but more on the Arctic. You tend to forget that, but of course, Indo-Pacific is not just limiting towards the Aleutians, etc., etc. I think it spills over into the Arctic. That's what they are worried about. At the same time, privately, the Russians do concede they are very unhappy. The so-called the rise of China. But here, they are now pitted against the Americans on one hand, and the Chinese and Russians would be a good choice for them. There's a good understanding. But if there is something does happen in the Indo-Pacific, or for that matter in the Western Pacific, I think the Russians are going to shy away. They'll just make statements because there are lots of stakes in the region and cannot afford to antagonize China or us, right? But the number of, I've also monitored the number of flights, strategic bombers flying out of Siberia in the Indo-Pacific has reduced considerably. The more towards the European theater, right? Very few ships. There was some talk about bringing in more ships from that theater towards the Indo-Pacific for this purpose. I haven't seen that happen. So the focus is Arctic and the European theater, less over here. This is my understanding of Russia and the Indo-Pacific. As far as Kuril Island is concerned, yes, with Japan, there have been some talks. Shinzo Abe was hopeful of breaking, some kind of, let's say, agreement with Putin. It didn't happen. Variety of reasons. I'm not familiar with those, but it didn't happen under Prime Minister Suga. I haven't seen much coming out. I think this will remain an issue. As far as Putin is growing stronger, he's more aggressive, right? I think he will. And looking at the way the so-called the US-led Japan, Australia gang up in terms of the Quad shaping up, the Russians are not quite comfortable with it. So I think it will remain a kind of a stalemate of sorts as of now. Sorry. As far as military confrontation, I don't think so. No, it's not there. They will come close to each other. They will not even try and rub shoulders because they've had that incident of EP3. That looms large in their minds. They will be showing up. Submarines will be sighting. As a matter of fact, 1994. That was, as a matter of fact, one can say 1994 was the beginning of the US-China tension. Chinese submarine showed up just about 40 nautical miles from the US carrier. And since then, this cat and mouse game has continued in some form or the other, right? But they have not run, other than the EP3 incident, which did involve a Chinese bravado of sorts. But I think there was some sense that we are not going to do it. But the signaling will continue. I think what would be interesting to watch is how often do the Chinese fire these DF-21s and DF-26. These are the potent weapons. They've got a range. They're signaling. They're sharing. The red lines are there. All right. Let us see how it will be unfolding. Because that has got the Americans wondering what they're going to do in terms of ballistic missile defense. That's why Guam is now getting a 360 defense kind of a system. As far as Beidou is concerned, very, very interesting area. Space, as a matter of fact, I don't know if you're familiar, they've also got a monitoring station in Karachi, in Pakistan. So they are going to be, as far as navigation is concerned, well, they're going to offer you away with the American system and then the French European system. All right. So this will, as we are going to come out with our own system. Right? So more satellites. As a matter of fact, here I must inject a little idea, and Mathesh would be able to bear me out. The rate at which the satellites are being produced, I think it's a cottage industry now. Right? At the same time, but not tailored or specific. And if you're going to have somebody talking about 4,000 satellites being launched, they'll be available. It will be like cottage industry in terms of launching. You have rockets launching now, 20 satellites of that kind of thing. And we're going to have, I think that is where we're going to see what kind of security, safety architecture is going to be seen. We've seen that last few days. We've seen some time ago, the Chinese satellite falling into, debris falling into Indian Ocean, etc., into the South China Sea. The debris over there right? That is going to get congested and contentious. That is where it will be. And uh, again, here is again my personal view. The whole architecture of state-led maritime domain awareness or air domain awareness will become privatized beyond the so-called territorial airspaces, the vertical columns. You're going to see lots of these satellites floating around. Private agencies are going to run. Shouldn't be surprised. Reliance tomorrow says, I'm going to launch about 40 private satellites. And I'll give you a navigation system in the Indian Ocean. Anybody for that matter will come. This is the shape of things which will happen. The whole idea today, the maritime domain, the MDA, etc., it is state-centric. States can, at a drop of a hat, strangulate you in terms of information. We all were worried about the GPS, the American GPS. We'll not be getting the coordinates for our missile launches or whatever. We're going to see privatization which is going on. We're going to see open spaces, the whole area will become more privatized, more stakeholders, and states will be limited to only a select few areas. Again, this is a wild thought, actually no idea, but this is what I'm thinking about how it will be transforming the whole space architecture, debris, scavenging. You'll need sweepers, space sweepers we'll be talking about. We'll have specialist vessels to bring all this debris, right? Will it burn off? How do we do about it? Management. Today we are only talking about strategy, policy, etc., etc. But where are the platforms that we're going to be scavenging? Who'll do scavenging, right? On the Delhi road that we have, clean up the roads. We'll have to clean up the space. I think there'll be a growth industry. I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Vijay. That's been an excellent coverage. There's space for one question. Anyone? Anybody wants to ask a question? And quickly, a very short question. Anybody? Okay. So I think we come to the end of the session today. And one last point that I probably would invite your comment is, with the rate at which artificial intelligence, drones, and swarming technology is taking off, and it's going to play a major role, and with the Chinese parallelly having focused on development of the aircraft carrier, I think that's going to impact on the aircraft carrier. I would actually in the future see the swarm technology and drone capabilities probably will signal the end of the aircraft carrier life, domination. And do you see that in the future?
Not really, sir. I mean, the platform will remain. It's something very interesting as well. This morning only, I was reading this very fascinating story. See, the Brits have put out their aircraft carrier, Queen Elizabeth. It is on its way, coming towards South China Sea. And what I found was that the F-35B were carrying out landing trials on the second of the class. That means 2 aircraft carriers. That means carriers are not going away. I'm just giving from the British perspective. The Chinese will maintain these carriers, maybe equip them with a new set of, let's say, equipment. In terms of drone, we are already talking about, you've seen those pictures, sir, just 3 days ago, about unmanned aircraft fueling a fighter. Now, all this is going to change. Yes. But to put them that far from the shore, will certainly, give them that enhanced reach. Indian Ocean, supposing we were to look at it, platform will be needed from which they can operate.
You need a platform, you're right.
Yes, you need a platform. Again, do we need an aircraft carrier for that matter? Do we need just a huge platform?
That was the point I was making. You don't need an aircraft carrier. It could come from any platform.
Any platform. That's why, sir, they are producing now, when they finish, I think 3 years from now, they'll have almost about more than a dozen vessels of 40,000 ton plus who are designed only as expeditionary platforms.
Oh, that's interesting.
A dozen, sir. So why build another carrier? And here it is just to compete with the Americans. You got 10 of them or 11 of them. I've got at least 4 of them.
That's right.
But I've got, you're talking about US Blue Ridge kind of thing vessels. I've got more than a dozen, which are more modern. They're just means to put it through sea. And I'm going to operate a different set of, let's say, toys out of that. So it is going to be a different world, but platforms, I think, will remain central to maritime operations.
That's right.
And I won't put carriers will remain central. I want to use the word platform with expeditionary capability. That means long reach.
Power projection and expedition.
Yes, of a different kind, not led by. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that next time the Chinese submarine comes, it'll in its torpedo tube, it will not be torpedoes. Because UUVs will be pushed out like the mother. They push out half a dozen of them, do your work, come back, or expendable. This is what will worry us. For which we have to start thinking differently.
Yes.
We have to go with the premise that it is not going to be the torpedo which will be coming at you. It will be the swarm of these scattered all over, expendable. They'll change the entire so-called, your whole strategy will be thrown into, I'll call it control all day. So that is where, I would call it disruptive thinking would be needed.
Thank you, Vijay. It's been excellent, listening to you and the great interaction that we've had. And I think the Peninsula Foundation is wonderfully, enriched with this evening's exposition. So thank you once again. And let me invite Dharika to, give the word of
Good evening, all. It gives me immense pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks for this wonderful event. We thank Dr. Vijay Sakhuja for accepting our invitation despite his busy schedule and providing us with valuable insights into this topic. And thanks to Air Marshal M. Matheswaran for moderating this event. I also thank the audience for their interesting questions. I think that it really enriched our conversation, and I'm sure all of us have benefited immensely from it. We hope to interact with you in the future again, Dr. Sakhuja. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Dharika. Thank you.
Thanks,
Vijay.
sir.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, sir.
And thanks to everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks to all the audience.